Hello, I'm Hushi, and I haven't done one of these for a while, and I'm sorry. It has been an incredibly busy summer. It seems to always be kind of busy in summer, but I'm trying to take some time to plan out future videos, especially the art tutorial ones, because I really like doing them, and people seem to enjoy them. I just want to make sure that they're as valuable as they can possibly be. And I was having some mic issues, but I think that I've mostly worked them out by now, so let's hope that that is true. I am coming to you today with another Hushi Talks, and this is another, as usual, mostly improvised review, critique, something like that, and instead of doing one thing, I am actually going to cover, or at least touch upon, 3 things. I'm going to start out with a thing that you'll probably know if you're a horror fan, and that is Lamberto Bava's Demons. This is a horror classic released in 1985 and composed, in terms of screenplay, by Dario Argento. Argento is best known for a lot of his films that happened in about that decade between the mid-70s and the mid-80s. There are some outliers that are worth noting, but most people will recognize him for films like Suspiria, which is his best known and, in my opinion, his best film. Demons was an iconic film, and I think, honestly, it is the best presentation of the cursed film. There are a lot of things that happen in it that don't make exactly sense, but it has a sort of a dreamlike atmosphere, and in fact, it is a bad dream. It's a nightmare. So some of the things aren't always coherent, but they are effective. They do have impact. I'm not saying that there's no problem that I have with Demons. I do have some issues with it, but it is an excellent movie overall, and it works very well as a film, especially a horror film. It doesn't really explain what's happening. You have to sort of assume what's happening, but a lot of it can be assumed by some of the things that happen in it. There are a lot of questions still by the end of Demons, and they're not answered because I don't think any of them have easy answers. We still don't know the true nature of this film and why the people watching it were either turned into horrifying monsters or killed outright. And the scariest thing about it is that the film that they watch doesn't seem to be too exceptionally different or particularly scary, or even depict anything particularly shocking. It's just a horror film. However, it is implied that some of the things that they do in the film are actually a real ritual, causing the chaos to break out in the theater, which they then find themselves locked into with no ability to leave. That is one of the most terrifying parts of it, is the fact that these people really haven't done anything that we know of that would really cause them to be condemned in this way, but they are doomed to watch this cursed film and doomed to stay in the theater for the effects after the film. It's a very compelling film and is one of the best examples of this whole cursed film genre. In fact, I think it may be the best that I have ever seen. I can't think of anything else that really outdoes it. I think part of what makes it so scary is because most all of the circumstances are very believable going into it. You could feel like you might incidentally or accidentally be a part of this, and then by the time you realize what's going on, it's too late to get out of it. The characters aren't super deep, but it's easy to understand what they're about very quickly, and we come to care about a lot of the characters because of how relatable they are. It also has an excellent soundtrack, and it's all very appropriate for what's happening in the film. I also have to say that Urbano Barberini, he is so fine. I know you've probably seen him if you saw Mystery Science Theater. He was in the film Outlaw of Gore, but he was also in a variety of films, mainly Italian productions, obviously, at the time, and just absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous man to watch. Also a good actor. In any case, I will say that Demons is one of my favorite films because of how it deals with this so well. It is a fun film if you like horror. It doesn't get too far into the why and the whereabouts, because the whys and the whereabouts are not important. Now, the other 2 things that I'm going to cover are 2 rather similar, made-for-television, essentially, anthology episodes. The first is Masters of Horror, which is basically like American Horror Story before American Horror Story. Except it's more like American Horror Stories, which is to say it was a series of standalone films that were rather short, that generally had what we consider iconic horror directors and writers on the production. And one of these was John Carpenter's film Cigarette Burns. Cigarette Burns is basically John Carpenter does Dario Argento, which is kind of funny to think about. Even the music, which I believe was done by Carpenter's son, it is very reminiscent of what you would hear in something like Suspiria or Inferno or something like that. It had a sort of a distinctiveness that you just could not mistake for anything else. But the neat thing about Cigarette Burns' soundtrack is that it's never really too obtrusive. It's never really so noticeable that it takes you out of what's going on, which is really a good thing, because there are so many parts where you could be easily taken out of it. Cigarette Burns is about a cursed film, and you will not get a lot of the detail of the story by watching it, because it has that dreamlike sort of illogic where you just sort of have to go with it. In Cigarette Burns, whenever there is something that you would have to think about and say, that really doesn't make much sense, it's kind of stupid, it goes off onto something else so you don't think about it too much, which is good because that's essentially what you want the audience not to do when you're trying to make a kind of a dream logic story. In Cigarette Burns, a man named Kirby, played by Norman Reedus, of all people, who was not the well-known actor he is now, still very good in his role. This is an excellently acted film. It has Udo Kier, Norman Reedus, and a bunch of others. I especially noticed Gwyneth Walsh as Katja later. There are so many really, really good actors in this, and they are really what makes the episode work. Because right from the beginning, it steps into the what the fuck is this shit. It has a very strong element of dark fantasy. This is not just a down-to-earth mundane thing. And the cigarette burns, which are brought up early on in the story, are supposed to be something that signal that something bad is about to happen. Something major, extreme, and usually bad is about to happen. And they overdo it a little bit. It's a little unsubtle. It's not super unsubtle, but it's kind of unsubtle. Basically, Kirby is hired by Mr. Bellinger, who is played by Udo Kier and named only a couple of times in the film, to get this legendary horror film called La Fin Absolue du Monde by Hans Barkovich. And it's supposedly a lost film. Like, supposedly there was a screening, but the government seized it before he could get it out of the country and it was destroyed. However, this was not done. No further detail has gone into this, just that we know that the film exists because one of the stars exists. And we find that apparently this existing star, which Bellinger keeps in a chamber on a turntable, which is odd enough, apparently this star is an angel whose wings were ripped off during the film, and they actually did that. Which makes me have my first point of kind of contention with the film, because you have introduced an overtly fantastical element in an angel who looks kind of creepy. Like, it's a very good makeup because the creature looks creepy. But it never really explains any part of anything that happens during the film. So basically you have to put everything together. And while I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily, in this sort of film it's really essential that we understand at least some of it. All we really get are that Kirby was once a junkie, his girlfriend slash maybe wife, Annie, I guess she committed suicide, and she was also a junkie, but Kirby had already accepted a loan from his to-be father-in-law for $200,000 to keep a film theater, a cinema, running. So they both miss her, obviously, but the father is just a real douche. And One of the biggest problems I had with the film was his overt douchiness. Like, he comes at the beginning of the film to sort of threaten Kirby that if he isn't paid back in full by the end of the week or something, he's going to come back, and he pulls open his coat to show that he has a gun shoved in his waistband, which, this is always hilarious to me. Get a fucking holster. Otherwise, you're gonna shoot your dick off. Like, sorry, not sorry, but this is stupid to begin with. So every time I see someone with a gun just jammed in their waistband, I always think, okay, this is a fucking idiot. But it is a bad idea to go to someone and signal to them very unequivocally that you are totally willing to resort to mortal threats. I would say that if someone sees that, they are totally understandable if they think, well, I've got nothing to lose. And I'm sorry, even at the time, which was about 2005, you could not just walk in to a movie theater, even a fairly niche one as this one, and be visibly carrying a gun, and not properly, and threaten implicitly someone with that gun without getting in significant amounts of trouble. Like, it doesn't even matter if you did loan this guy money that he has not yet paid you back. If you are in his place of business with a gun, it does not matter who you are. You are going to get in some trouble. If they called the police on you right then and there would probably be all kinds of difficulty. So that was my first problem with this. But I was able to put it aside because you could give it that. You could give it that, you know, maybe this guy was just crazy. Maybe Kirby just didn't want to deal with him and just wanted to get him out of his life, which seems to be consistent with literally everything else that happens in the movie. As he gets closer to getting this film for Mr. Bellinger, Kirby starts to have these weird visions and things like that. He listens to an interview that a film reviewer had, and it seems like it's difficult to find anything of Bakovich, that it's like everybody who has something of his has suffered in some way or is cursed in some way. All the people that he comes into contact with that have had any contact with the film or its production crew, and all of the crew have died since then, and it wasn't made that long ago. So it's a very suspicious film. A lot of things happen during the course of the film that are surreal and disturbing, and it really does paint an interesting and kind of unsettling scenario, and it has a lot of really effective effects in it. Like, there are some amazing practical effects in this that are just flawless. But it's never clear on what it's actually doing or what the story really is. So you can't really put it together, but you also can't just tune out and be a part of the film because it's not coherent enough for that. You just have to sort of accept things as they happen, but you're not putting it together, so it's not as suspenseful as it could or should be. And that was my big problem with it. A lot of the acting is very good, and they really make you believe that this could have happened. But it's never clear as to whether Bakovich was being punished for what he did, or if everyone is being punished for what they are kind of complicit in by seeing the film even, or by having any contact with Bakovich. His widow seems to be very affected by his life and torment and passing. She has hated the film and presumably has seen it, but they also say that the film was not really finished per se. It was an experimental film, but it was screened before it was really done, which really doesn't fit with the rest of the narrative, but it's stated at one point, and that does cause a problem later, at least in my mind. There's so much promotional for it, and there's so much stuff that Bellinger has been able to put hands on around a film that was only screened once at a film festival where it was extremely controversial. It's interesting, and there are some parts of it that were just delightfully funny in an odd way, in a twisted way. Like, there's a scene where this very sensual guy, who is clearly not a good guy, basically gives Kirby a lap dance, and it's very sexy, but it's also very funny. I don't think it was intended to be. I think it was intended to be kind of disturbing, but it's very funny to me. And I guess that's because I know more about Norman Reedus now, and it just strikes me as hilarious because you knew he was cool with this. But in any case, The film is pretty effective, but not as effective as it really should be. What we find out by the end is that apparently the film is a promise about what torment awaits or something like that. But the thing is, Bellinger wants Kirby to find the film because he wants to experience a moment of heaven when he apparently believes that he has an eternity of suffering ahead of him. But the film isn't about a moment of heaven, and he has the angel without his wings. He has the wings over his desk, I believe, but he has the angel there, so why doesn't he just experience the bit of heaven by being nice to the angel or something? But he has nothing but contempt for it. He throws ice cubes at the angel. So it's a very weird thing to say that this was a promise of things to come, and this is why it drives people crazy and they kill themselves and each other. But wouldn't that just be getting you to the torment faster? If it's such a horrifying experience and a harrowing one, then why exactly is it that people are so eager to either off themselves or off the people around them, or both, after they see it? That doesn't make any sense. And the angel getting the reels back at the end and thanking Kirby also does not make sense. I know it's supposed to be surrealistic and supposed to be very fantastical, but it takes away from a lot of the impact if it doesn't make sense. If you can't put two and two together and then anticipate what's coming from that, then you lose a lot of the suspense and tension that really is essential with horror. So while it is an interesting and overall enjoyable film, it has certain elements of it that even the excellent all-round acting can't really fix. And by the end, you just get annoyed, because it does seem to say that a work of art, and most especially a film in this case, can be a weapon or a curse or something that attacks the audience, whether it's intended to or not, and that the audience is complicit in this because they are digesting it. It's something that I've always believed in art, that even if the audience is just you, a work of art really should be digested, it should be processed, it should be perceived by someone in order to complete it, even if that person is the author. It's why I reread a lot of my stuff many, many times, because I feel like otherwise it's not complete. And I'm completing it by doing that, and it satisfies me doubly, I suppose you could say, in that sense. Cigarette Burns is worth checking out, but it has a certain feel to it that makes it feel a bit less subtle than it could and should be. If it were more subtle, and if it either eschewed or toned down the overt fantastical elements and made us question what is really happening more, it would have been a better film. Because we sort of sympathize with Kirby, but not super duper really. It is interesting that by the end of the film he doesn't want to see the movie, though watches it anyway, inexplicably, but we haven't seen much else change. I did like the fact that while it did deal with some straight people baby daddy shit, it did it in a subtle way. It wasn't all about his relationship with his deceased wife, it was more about she was a part of his life for a while and then she died. Her popping up every so often does end up being kind of unsettling, but it's not a giant part of it, and it really shouldn't be. So that's another way in which it does a good job. I think it's overall very much worth watching, although it will not live up to the expectations you may have if you've seen, for example, Demons. And so we have started off with the best I know of, a decent imitation, or something aspiring to be similar without being a retread, and now we come to probably the worst of the three things that I'm covering, and that is in fact American Horror Stories, which is a new anthology series where every episode or two are self-contained stories. Presumably this takes place in the American Horror Story universe, although considering what happens later, I'm not sure if it really does or not. The episode is called Drive-In, and it is about a cursed film. There is so much wasted time with high schoolers in the first half of this. Well, really the whole episode, but much more in the first half. Right from the get-go, it is really hard to give a shit about this. The acting all around is pretty good from the principals, but not great. The, I guess, gender-fluid friend named D is very cool and very, very well acted by Ben Pierce. And some of the supporting cast are exceptional, it's just that they don't get anything to do. And when you finally get to the really, really good actors like legend Adrienne Barbeau, who is always great in everything, and Naomi Grossman, who is always great in everything, they're wasted. This is so far beneath them. They add so much to the story, and their acting really, really elevates the material, but they've got nothing or next to nothing to work with. And that's my biggest problem with it. This is about a film called Rabbit Rabbit, which has apparently caused a massacre the first time it was shown. And evidently, Bitterman, which is a hilarious name for a bitter, jaded director that wants to attack his audience with his work of art. Larry Bitterman, the director and creator of Rabbit Rabbit, wanted to destroy his audience, wanted to crush their souls. So because of this massacre occurs, and this is my first and biggest problem with it. One of the main characters, Chad, hilariously named Chad, looks up a video of this film being banned, and Larry Bitterman is in front of Tipper Gore, who was and is a total idiot, but he loses it when she says, what would you say if I said I had a letter from the studio saying that they would give over all copies of the movie and remove it from distribution and showings. And he goes crazy and just jumps up there and starts wailing on her, which was hilarious because she is a horrible person. But it also made everything after it, which is most of the episode, nonsensical. It set a tone for comedic ridiculousness by trying to fit it into the real world. This is a thing that Cigarette Burns did much, much better. By making it a film that had only been shown in part, in an unfinished version, once, and was very controversial and disappeared after that, that made it much easier to believe. While I did have some trouble believing parts of Cigarette Burns, and I did think it went overboard with the overt fantastical elements, it was much better in the handling of something that would have to be, realistically, a very obscure film that had only been shown once, was difficult to get, and that maybe, though several people had looked for it, not all of them had been able to find it. Rabbit Rabbit, on the other hand, is something that we never see much of. We barely get to understand anything about it, and there's nothing really disturbing about it. It is remarkably irrelevant, and while in Demons, similarly, the film was fairly irrelevant, you could believe that it might have something to do with what was going on. But this production can't even be bothered to give us the clips that Cigarette Burns did of Le Fin Absolu du Monde. And that is part of what makes it so bad. It lags behind better examples, but it doesn't do anything to distinguish itself and make itself better. It would have been interesting to see even just brief clips like in Cigarette Burns, which allow us to make the connections that this was a horrible film, no one should ever see anything but clips of it, and even that could be dangerous. With Rabbit Rabbit, it's a weird name, it's got a sort of a provenance on it, but we don't see enough of it or hear enough about what is around it to make us really tense about it. Another recent film called Antrim did this much better by claiming that there was a disaster when it was shown and some people died and it became controversial, and they even had some fake interviews that were rather convincing, even if the film was not great or particularly subtle. I found it very unsubtle, the way that they tried to put little bits in it and maybe things like subliminal little flashes of frames, but it was so unsubtle that it was very easy to pick out. It was very noticeable, so it kind of took away from the movie, and it wasn't that suspenseful or tight or disturbing a film to me. So Antrim was okay, but this is a step down from that because we don't even really have anything that takes that much effort. We should feel as the audience that we are being drawn into a nightmarish scenario, and probably from nothing we did. We're not guilty of anything in particular, probably, and the film would have no reason to curse us, but the horror is that we are cursed anyway by being complicit in this whole situation, by digesting the film. That's what Cigarette Burns was all about. Digesting the film, being a part of that creative process, makes you complicit and makes you guilty. So you will suffer because of that movie. With Rabbit Rabbit, it's just nonsensical. While there are definitely artists out there, filmmakers in fact, who had a philosophy of challenging the audience by harrowing the audience, by putting images in front of the audience that basically torture them. Cruelty, horrific cruelty, depicted in art. It's something that Cigarette Burns did touch on, and that real artists have touched upon themselves. As Norman Reedus' character Kirby says in Cigarette Burns, you know, it's just a movie. This isn't anything special. You just made a movie. But if you think about it, it could be more special. It could be something more horrific as well, more evil. And that's what we missed in American Horror Story's drive-in episode. But I will say that I wish they could get away from writing American Horror Story style. They keep wanting to make things bigger than they are. So they put in Tipper Gore and her infamous censorship crusade. But it didn't need to be there. It made it more unbelievable that this would be something that had had that kind of attention yet somehow managed to disappear completely. That's not something that happens. And as an artist, it's even more difficult, especially 80s and beyond, to fully get rid of something like that. It would be incredibly difficult for them to go into something that was clearly put together with an incredible amount of artistic focus and a specific goal and say, this is obscene and should be stamped out. Obscenity is difficult at best to prove, but in this case it would be even more difficult because it had been apparently successful at what he intended for it to do. But more on that later. They spend too much time wasting it on interpersonal relationships of teenagers we don't really care about, and straight people baby daddy shit we similarly don't care about. The whole reason why Chad takes Kelly, the two main characters, to the drive-in is because it is supposed to be a dangerous movie because it's controversial, and what better way to get her to put out? But it doesn't really work for that. It makes them seem like idiots. Because they are idiots. They're only competent when they have to be, and when they have to be, it's cartoonish and ridiculous. They should have spent more time building up the film so that when they actually go to the drive-in, it's tense. They tried to do that with Naomi Grossman's character, Rabid Ruth, who was fantastic and, narratively speaking, was the hero of peace. Unfortunately, they didn't seem to realize that in writing, so she got basically 2 scenes and that was it. But she brought so much to it. Similarly, Adrienne Barbeau brought so much to it, because we actually gave a shit about her drive-in because her character got some development. She was an interesting character, and she, like Naomi Grossman, was basically given 2 scenes and that's it. Wow. Wow. What a waste of incredible talent. Some of the icons of our time being used as basically elevated cameos in a very poorly done, poorly composed attempt at being suspenseful. All of the more interesting teenagers basically get turned into evil creatures or killed off at the drive-in, and it's up to Chad and Kelly to manage to get out. But the thing is, we care about them the least of anyone. And especially when they decide to go after the filmmaker and destroy any remaining copies of the film, it just becomes cartoonish. There's a Scooby-Doo level of exposition that explains too much and at the same time doesn't explain any of the things that we actually care about. So, unfortunately, by the end of it, it's just an incoherent thing that we don't really have any investment in. The horrific part, certainly, is that watching basically any significant portion of Rabbit Rabbit turns you into some sort of rage zombie. And there was some penis violence, which I always find distasteful, and an incredibly lazy crutch. It's not scary, it's just gross, and we don't want to see it. Torture porn and graphic violence are not in and of themselves scary. They're just distasteful. They do create revulsion, and they do make people uncomfortable, both of which are important facets of horror. However, they are not something that you can just rely on to make people think this is horror. A high body count does not make something horror. It does not make it horrific. You can have no one die at all during a horror film, and it still will be tense. That's why you choose your deaths in your horror film, and you make them spectacular. They should be something that people remember, and that people are kind of hit by. If someone dies and an audience member is just like, oh well, then you have failed, because you should always set up something that major in any film to be a gigantic response from the audience. I remember when I was watching Jason X in the cinema, every single kill just about got a huge reaction from the audience, and that's what made it so fun. That's what makes horror so fun. In this case, though, not so much. And especially the ending, where they tried to do it one better and do the usual American Horror Story needless, pointless twist, where, oh my god, Rabbit Rabbit got on Netflix, oh, he put on Netflix and chill, but it's Rabbit Rabbit and people are watching. Well, see, here's the thing. That would not be on Netflix. There is an actual process to get your stuff on Netflix. That would have to be screened for them. They do not put up film sight unseen on their site. They cannot afford to do that. And if you think that you are just going to be like, oh, well, you know, you don't have a better option, this is a super controversial film, like, why wouldn't you put it on Shudder or something? Something that actually has something to do with horror. But that aside, there is still a screening process for Netflix, and they're not going to put just any shit up there that doesn't have production value, nobody knows what the fuck it is. They're not just going to be like, oh, this lost horror film, you know, we're just going to put it up there. Because if it really was that contentious, and they got to the level of congressional hearings where this thing was absolutely taken out of circulation and destroyed for what they knew, sorry, that's not going to be something that's easy or really even possible to do, except with a massive amount of interest in the film and a massive amount of people who have actually had to sit down and see the film. And that would start what was apparently enough to make this entire town go crazy. Like, what they showed at the end was, oh, well, I guess all of our friends are dead and all the people in our town are going to die, but hey, you know, this is horrifying. This was on Netflix and we thought we won and it was a twist. No, it's not a twist. It doesn't work. It especially doesn't work in the American Horror Story universe, where this can be presumed to take place, because this sort of thing would be noticed. And I know the witches are not crusaders for good, but this is another potential apocalypse. If you have a cursed film on a streaming platform, which, like I said, does not make sense, does not work, they would have to have people who see that, and in the best case scenario, those people would go crazy, never get back to them, and Netflix would just say, okay, well, next movie, we're not putting that on our service. Either they would just never get back to them, and then they would try and get someone else, and they would never get back to them, or they would have a horrifying situation where nothing would be relevant. They wouldn't be putting anything on their streaming service because everybody would be zombies or dead. But even that aside, something that can affect that large a population of people, it's like another apocalypse. And anybody with power is going to have to be like, okay, well, I've got to do something responsible and get rid of this. So either they're going to have to do something with the witches with this film, or someone that has some power to do something, or I guess they're just fucked. Even though none of it makes sense. And that really is what it comes back to. The two leads are not that interesting, but they also don't have a lot of good writing to work with. The reason why Naomi Grossman as Ruth and Adrienne Barbeau as Verna work so well is because they have something to work with, and they're really, really solid actors. But even they cannot just produce something out of nothing. They cannot create a narrative around them, especially since both of them have only 2 or 3 scenes at most. Everything else is just meaningless and pointless. We basically get the feeling by the end, by the stupid little twist that should not have existed, that nothing really meant anything. Nothing that anyone did in the entire episode amounted to anything, and we have just wasted our time completely and thoroughly by watching this. And I don't like that feeling. I don't like that sort of sense. In Demons, most of the people don't survive, it's true, but there was a point. It felt like there was a point. They got out of the theater. Maybe that was it. Maybe that was the thing. Them getting out of the theater in Demons, that was a major part, and it was very near the end. But chaos had started outside, and that made it a very tense ending. It was also not really clear on what had happened at the end. It left you thinking about a lot of things with a lot of unanswered questions that you could imagine, that you felt like you wanted to imagine. With Drive-In, it's like, I don't really need answers to any of these things, but the emphasis was on all the wrong things at every point, and then they tried to just throw in a twist at the end that didn't work and made no sense, so it left us with a feeling of hollowness and meaninglessness. This is the thing about American Horror Story, and also about American Horror Stories. I think that the crew and the creative staff, the writing crew, are better suited to one-shots and maybe two-shots at most. You know, a two-parter in this American Horror Stories scenario format. But in this case, they blew it. They fucked it up. That was not good. And while they did have excellent actors in it, legends, they were not given enough to do. Like John Carroll Lynch, for example, plays Larry Bitterman, and you might remember him as Twisty, and he did a great job as that character. He does the best he can as Bitterman, but he's just not given good stuff, so he can only do so much. As a result, he feels wasted too. Pretty much everyone feels completely wasted. It's not that tense. It's not really fun. It's not funny. They have situations with completely unrealistic responses. Like the hearing I told you about, completely unrealistic. Someone claims to have this letter but doesn't show it to you and doesn't back that up in any way, so you lose your mind and physically assault her? Why not just sit there and be like, yeah, okay, prove it? Because that would be a hard thing to prove, and you would be entitled to ask her that. If she claims that she has this carte blanche from the studio and they're going to give over all the copies of the film they have, yeah, prove it. Go ahead. We've got time. We're on TV. But all of the music video moments, like walking away from burning trailer to pop music, really lame. Really cringe-worthily lame. Like, I don't even care about, some people have bitched about the dialogue and, it's not like how real teenagers sound. Nobody wants to listen to real teenagers. Let's just be honest here. Nobody wants to listen to real people speak like real people. So, anybody that has a problem with that in script writing, I always say, fuck 'em. Unless it's just ridiculous. Unless it's just utterly overdramatic, ridiculous shit that sounds like it's trying to be Shakespeare. Like, take that away, fuck it, whatever. But I do think that one of the worst parts of Drive-In was the fact that it did concentrate on teenagers. American Horror Story is always at its best when it is not dealing with teenagers. In fact, most shows that deal with teenagers, that's the weakest part of it. Look at Stranger Things. The first season of Stranger Things, the teenagers were pretty much irrelevant. They had touches of the main story, and some of them were kind of important. But even there, the most interesting characters were given the least to do, and ultimately they didn't have a lot to do with the overall narrative. They were caught up in it, but if we focused on them, it was usually the weakest scenes and the most that we just didn't care. American Horror Story is at its best when it is dealing with adults in adult situations. We don't need teenager drama because ultimately teenager drama is fairly irrelevant. And when you have a giant situation like this, a potential apocalyptic situation, teenager drama shit is completely meaningless. One of the biggest things that this does, one of the biggest mistakes that this makes, is expecting us to care about the teenagers and their bullshit when there is much more important shit going on. And what's-her-face, Chad and Kelly, they're not compelling in any way. They're not written to be. They're incredibly boring and difficult to like. But we don't get hardly any time with Dee. We get a couple of scenes with the only people that have any real agency in the narrative. And this is a problem too. Like someone like Ruth, who survived the first massacre and is trying to get people not to watch this and to destroy the film. All she can do is show up with a sign and shout at people. I'm pretty sure that in real life, people would get organizations around them and mobilize movements. She would have more people with her, and they would be willing to help her. Also, she would not just stumble around not expecting the worst, because she lived through it. It was such a waste. Because, as I said, narratively speaking, Ruth was the hero. Ruth was the person trying to make everything better and trying to stop things from getting worse. And we had investment in Verna because she was an interesting character that was well played, but she got nothing to do. So we're with the boring couple that we were introduced to at the beginning, do not care about and don't want to hear about their sex life. They fail spectacularly, and we're basically no better off than we started. But the need to throw in meaningless twists that don't really work as twists and escalate it is probably the biggest problem that American Horror Story has. Even in these standalone episodes, you cannot have something that stands alone, yet is a potential world-ending situation. If you do, you have to handle it a lot better than this. Even though I didn't really care much for Halloween 3, it, at the very least, did its job very effectively. You could really believe that, by the end, the hero was trying to get this advert off the air, and he was almost there, and that was what made it so tense. He found out what was behind this, what they were planning, and what was going to happen. So there was that tension that was building gradually, more and more, snowballing until we got to the very end, and then we are just as frenzied and frantic as him, as he's trying on the phone to get these people to take this advert off the air, because it's going to kill countless children and other people. That would have been better if we had that with Drive-In. But unfortunately we spend more than the first half of it in the drive-in, and when they get out you have to kind of rush things. So you have a rushed resolution, a rushed confrontation, a bunch of exposition that really isn't necessary, and then you make them think like, oh well, you know, they solved it, they killed the bad guy, and they destroyed the film and everything, and then you throw in a twist. No, you get one or the other. They either win, even though it's ridiculous and completely rushed, or they don't even get there. The thing about Cigarette Burns is, when Kirby meets the widow of the filmmaker, she says no one else has gotten that far and it's too late for him. That would actually be a good ending for Drive-In. If they were looking into this and they were thinking, well, we've got to find the filmmaker and we've got to destroy the rest of the film, if they found someone close to him who said, well, it's too late for you, I can recognize that now, but no one's got this far yet. And then they have to think about what it means. It's too late for them. They've involved themselves too much? Because considering film is not only visual, it's also audio and just multimedia, multi-sensory experience, it probably was too late for them. Even if they didn't see a lot of the film because of the fog in their car, that doesn't mean they didn't hear the film, and it also doesn't mean that they didn't see elements of the images. If this was such a well-planned out film to assault its audience and, you know, crush their souls, it probably would be something where if you saw even just the basic images, it would trigger your imagination and you'd probably have some sort of horrifying experience. Maybe it was just slower with them than with the others. That would be horrifying too. I mean, I've come up with all these ways that this could be much more horrifying because it's really not horror. It's really not horrific. The only horrific moments are Ruth trying, begging desperately with Chad not to see the film and not to let his girlfriend see the film. And that's it, really. Nothing else is that horrifying. Most of the rest of it is cartoonish and stupid. It is inane and really just goes through the motions. And what I find most unforgivable is not only its slipshod writing, but also its waste of the best actors in it in favor of teenagers we were really challenged to give a shit about. Because basically all it is relationship bullshit with teenagers, and then teenagers trying to be clever, cool, and quippy. And that just doesn't work. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my trilogy of terror, so to speak. I would definitely advise checking out Demons. I would say Cigarette Burns is at least worth a watch. Drive-In, not so much. If you are really into American Horror Story, The American Horror Stories series is a little better because at least it doesn't have the usual tendency to start off with a pretty strong episode and then get much, much worse every subsequent one. But in this case, it just was not very good. It was a great idea, but it just wasn't a great execution. At the very least, if the script had been tightened up more, this would need to be a longer film experience. And if it's not going to be tightened up, then it should at least focus more on the things that it does well, which are very few in number and usually because of the excellent acting behind those things. American Horror Story and American Horror Stories both need to realize that escalation is not a good thing in writing, and continually escalating something, especially when you're trying to throw in a twist and, subvert expectations, which that phrase is completely ruined now. When you are trying to do that, you have to be striking. It has to be potent. Otherwise, all you've got is a bunch of incoherent nothing that might be a little creepy in some places, but is absolutely not horror. I'll see you next time. You're welcome. Bye.